Well, Wes, it's good to see you as always.
Thanks, Rob. Good to be here.
Well, last podcast you said, we haven't even talked about nets yet. And that's true. We really haven't gotten into any kind of detail about the history of nets, the vision of nets. What is nets, Wes?
It's not the easiest thing to describe because there's not many scenarios like this. There's not many ministries that are like this because nets combines a seminary component with an apprenticeship component with a missions agency and sending component. And we do all of those particulars pretty intensely. There's a seminary component. Now, we're not at all competing with seminaries. We're a finishing school. We're post-seminary, but we're doing very academic stuff. The guys are having to translate. They're having to put together sermons. They're preaching those sermons. They're getting evaluated. This is all the kind of stuff they do in seminary, only we've brought it all together and doing it in sort of a seamless way where they're taking all those disciplines they learned and they're doing them from start to finish and being evaluated both on the front end and on the back end. So there's an academic piece to it. There's an apprenticeship piece. We're throwing them into ministry in a local church, and they're doing real ministry. So most of the time, they're not able to do much ministry in seminary. The seminary churches usually have a lot of leaders in them. It's hard for instance, a seminary student to ever preach in a seminary church. So we're throwing them into real ministry. And then lastly, we're a sending agency. We are scoping out the landscape to find the perfect fit. We've assessed them during the year that they're here. We assess them 3 different ways, and we're trying to fit their skills, their gifts, their interests with what we have primarily in New England. So it's kind of a vertically integrated ministry, to use a business term. We're doing it from soup to nuts. Our title is the New England Training and Sending Center, and that's a pretty good summary. We're training and we're sending, but the training has both an academic piece and it has an apprenticeship actually in the ministry piece. They're both very strong in the training component.
When did you first have the vision of nets?
I think that vision, like my vision to go to New England, was initially stimulated by Dr. John Hanna, my professor at Dallas Seminary, church history professor that I had, and took every course that he offered. He had a particular penchant for New England. He had studied New England revivals. He's a big Jonathan Edwards guy. So I knew that a number of the Ivy League schools, almost every single one of them, I think save Cornell and Columbia, at least Cornell, were started in order to train leaders, including and especially ministry leaders. So I knew that New England had a very rich heritage with the awakenings of coming up with training paradigms. And he was particularly fond of a log cabin seminary started by a guy named William Tennant Sr., just north of Philadelphia. And 2 of the Tennant boys were big preachers in the Great Awakening, Gilbert Tennant and William Tennant Jr. And this guy started this log cabin seminary. I think only 19 guys ended up going through it, although 3 of those guys ended up being 3 of the 6 trustees who started Princeton College, which then produced Princeton Seminary. So I was just intrigued by this much more personal, close mentoring approach. Seminary is not very personal. Now, you can try to get to know your profs, and I'm a big supporter of seminary, but it's a graduate school, and it's mainly left brain. You're mainly working the cognitive side. I was intrigued by this mentoring idea, and I got saved through the Navigators, as we said earlier in one of the podcasts. They were big on one-to-one discipleship. So all of that sort of coalesced into me getting excited about some sort of a training paradigm so that we could facilitate church planting in New England.
So when you started Christ Memorial Church, was that already in your mind?
Yes.
This is where you wanted to go?
That's right, and which has been really helpful to Christ Memorial Church because the moment someone would attend the church, within a month they would know that we wanted to be not only a church planting church, but we wanted to be a training church. We wanted to be a church that was going to mentor church planter wannabes. And even though that didn't get solidified for another 8 years, we started moving in that direction in year 5. and we started having an advisory council. I picked several guys that I thought from the business world, from seminaries, pastors, and they'd come every summer for the better part of a week, and we would brainstorm. And we did that for 4 years, trying to really home in on the particular vehicle that we wanted this training vehicle to be.
And when was that?
96, 97, 98, 99. And we also had a very important mentor in my life was a fellow named George Hill. I mentioned him before. He was a Fortune 100 management consultant, and we had him, the elders had him for a long weekend to really pick apart the idea. He came away excited about the idea. So we did our due diligence. We did not rush into this. You know, the old adage, you chase 2 rabbits, you get none. We didn't want to do that. I didn't want to cannibalize Christ Memorial Church. But it seemed like the two could be nicely merged and facilitate one another. So we didn't technically launch Nets until the summer of 2000.
Okay, so a little history lesson here. So we're saying you've got a team of select individuals helping you flesh out the vision, talk about particulars for about 4 years, particularly in the summer.
In the summertime.
96 through 2000. There's always got to be the first guy. Who was your first resident? Where did you find him? How did that all convalesce?
So in the process of doing this vetting of the idea, I started recruiting for Christ Memorial Church's first plant. And in 1997, Sue and I were going to a conference in San Antonio, and in our layover in Dallas, we met with Don and Dory Williman. And there seemed to be a real interest there. Don was a student at Dallas as well. He also majored in Hannahology, like me. So I could tell that we were cut from similar bolts of cloth. So they got pretty excited about it. We signed a contract. They moved up in early summer 98, and then we sent them out. We recruited them specifically to plant in Hanover, New Hampshire, where Dartmouth College is. We were looking for that specific plant. And they left in 99, September, and then they launched Christ Redeemer Church in September of 2000. So he was kind of our lab rat, if you will. Things have changed a lot since Don came, but it was enough to make it clear to me that there was something to this, and we wanted to go for it.
Why Hanover, New Hampshire?
Well, I had wanted to plant in Dartmouth and had gotten steered away from it by some folk who I now know weren't clear about the need. And part of the reason I wanted to plant in Hanover was because, first of all, it's Ivy League school. We wanted to plant where we could minister to students. I got saved when I was a student at Ohio State. I met Sue when I was a student at Ohio State. So things happen on college campuses that are significant. But secondly, the guy that founded Dartmouth had been a pastoral apprentice to Jonathan Edwards. And when Edwards preached his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God, in Enfield, Connecticut, the impact, this was right in the middle of the First Great Awakening, the impact was so great that people started wailing, falling on the floor, shrieking, "I'm going to hell, I'm going to hell." And Edwards couldn't finish his sermon. And so the apprentice, Eleazar Wheelock, who founded Dartmouth, stood up, ended the service in prayer, and Wheelock had started Moore's Indian Charity School in Connecticut in order to train Native Americans to preach the gospel. So he decided he wanted to expand and, kind of go out on the frontier a little bit. So he relocated in Hanover, New Hampshire. And originally when Dartmouth was started, it was going to be continuing to train Native Americans. Now, they ended up expanding that vision. So, I love Edwards. I like Wheelock. His church, the church that he founded, is still right in the middle of Dartmouth's campus. I don't know. I'm just kind of nostalgic. I thought it was all cool. Their motto is a voice crying out in the wilderness, which it was utter wilderness. It still kind of is. So since we didn't plant, I thought, well, our first plant ought to be there.
Did Don share that vision with you? Did he come to New England to be mentored and to plant in Hanover, New Hampshire?
Yes, that was the job description, is we're looking for a man to come and plant in Hanover. It wasn't like we do now where it's more negotiated. So right up front, he was asked if he wanted to come and be a part of our mentorship program, with the outcome being an attempt to plant a church in Hanover. And I want to say something just about God's grace to us. Multiple denominations have attempted to plant in Hanover, and none have been successful. But Don's has been a smash hit. Great guns, 300 to 400 people, 75 Dartmouth students. Don has done a great job there. And I think our residency program was very helpful. And Don would say it was very helpful to allowing them to really hang in there during the tough times.
How was it helpful?
Well, Don would say it was really helpful for his marriage. Other guys have said that it was helpful because it strengthens their confidence that the gospel works. And we don't have to come up with any bells and whistles, any new ideas. Yes, we want to be relevant to our culture, but it's the faith handed down once for all to the saints. It's the old-time gospel. So I think it helped him to see an established church where you didn't have to capitulate. You could hold to biblical doctrines with zeal and robustly. I think it was helpful financially. We were sending music teams down initially to help them with their services because they only had about 29 people when they started. It was helpful just in generally giving them long-term coaching support. Don and I were talking in those early years, and a lot of big decisions get made in those first 2 or 3 years. And the ongoing coaching ministry of Nets has been utilized by all the guys we've sent out.
So after Don planted Christ Redeemer Church in Hanover, were there other men in line ready for the Nets residency program?
No, because remember, Nets wasn't officially established until the summer of 2000. So Don came in the summer of 1998. We sent him out September of 1999. He planted like 3 months after Nets became formalized. So once Nets became formalized, now we had to start thinking about, well, what's the process? What do we need to do? And we knew we needed to figure out how to recruit, and we knew we needed to get some sort of housing opportunity because Don had lived in the youth parsonage. And now we were about ready to hire a youth pastor. We did in a couple of years from there. And we didn't have any place for him to live. It's difficult to get somebody to move up here unless you have a place for him to live. So we then began shopping and were able to purchase our first 4 condos, I think probably in 2002. And I began going to seminaries trying to recruit. Probably in 2001, I went. Remember, I'm still the full-time senior pastor of Christ Memorial Church, which is a growing church. In fact, the year 1999, 2000, we had our first little mini awakening, as I shared earlier. So I was a busy, busy boy, but we began to inch out and start to do some recruiting.
So your feeling was that if you're going to be inviting men, married men, often with children, you need a place to house them.
Well, that's right. I mean, this isn't like anybody's destination place, maybe for a vacation, but not to live. It's not sunny most of the time. We do have winter here. The spring is non-existent. It's just cold and rainy most of the time. Summers are beautiful. Fall's beautiful. If you do winter sports, winter's kind of fun. But it's cold. And most of the seminaries are south of the Mason-Dixon line. So I began figuring out, well, what is it going to take for us to lure folk to consider a ministry here? And one of the first things was, well, we got to offer them housing and free housing. There has to be a draw. So we went to work and we were able to purchase and pay cash for our first set of condos. We had 4 condos.
And did that get things rolling?
It did. And we brought our first class up in 2003.
What kind of men were you recruiting? What kind of men were you looking for?
Well, you need to realize that regardless of what kind of men you're ideally hoping for, when you're starting something up from scratch, and we've already said it's kind of a weird ministry. You can't easily categorize it. You're just hoping you can get anybody. So we really just were interested in people that thought they might be interested in this. We didn't really have the luxury to be too particular. And I'm not saying anything negative about the early guys, but it's now clear that a number of those guys probably weren't church planters. Let's just say it that way. So you're just trying to get some momentum. You're trying to not be saying to people, well, we've never had anybody ever go through our program. We think it would be pretty good if you'd come up and give it a try. That you don't want that to be your advertising stick. So we really were just pretty much open arms to anyone that thought they were excited about this situation.
So you thought it was a bit of a hard sell. Is it still a hard sell?
It's not as hard a sell. The difference, though, I would say, is that I don't think today's generation is generally as risk-taking as maybe 40 or 50 years ago. So the harder sell is they're wanting to know more things about, well, what kind of program is it? What are the benefits? As one guy asked me, do you have paternity leave? I mean, it's a very different model from Jim Elliot, going down and ministering in Ecuador.
Well, some might be listening to this podcast saying, I still don't really understand what it is that you're talking about. It sounds like an internship, or it sounds like a residency. It sounds like a mentoring time.
Yes.
Can you put a little finer point on it? Talk to the people that are listening, that are asking themselves, what is this?
Yes. I'm very high on seminary, Rob. I've said that before. But when you go to seminary, as one professor put it, you're really trying to find out what the questions are. And you are really being taught some tools to try to answer those questions. So the first thing that NETS attempts to do is help you really hone those tools so that you're not just saying, yeah, I had Greek, or yeah, I had a preaching class, or yeah, I think we did something in leadership, but you're actually practicing those things and doing it over and over and over and over again. So those skills get really honed. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is seminary does not really familiarize you very well with pastoral ministries. Like I said, it's mainly cognitive development, very important, I think critical, but the pastorate is, I would say, more of an art than a science. Ministering to people, trying to triage situations, trying to diagnose what's really going on in a person's life, in a couple's life, in a family's life, trying to work with a congregation, trying to work with an elder board. All of that is a lot more finesse and requires a wisdom that experience is the best teacher for than anything you could get reading a book. So we're introducing them to that because, of course, we're sending guys out to be senior pastors. So they've got to be able to have some sense of the whole before they go out. And so we're introducing them to and allowing them to participate in a number of those things that move them along in terms of practical pastoral skills. Here's how you run a meeting. Here's how you prep for the meeting. One of the big management slogans around here is no surprises. George Hill taught me that. No surprises. If you come into a meeting and people are surprised, you didn't prep for the meeting right. You didn't prep them for the meeting right. People don't like surprises. People are resistant to change. So if you bring in a surprise, call a congregational meeting and announce you want to change the service time. Instead of meeting at 9, you want to meet at 8. Boy, if you haven't tilled that soil and really, had a few focus groups on that, that's going to go over like a lead balloon. So it's all of that you don't get in seminary. And then the last thing is someone really taking interest in you enough to help place you in an appropriate position. I mean, there's a reason we've had no failures, Rob. And the first reason is God's grace. And the second reason is we're very careful in assessing people and in placing them in situations. I've vetted churches in some cases 2 and 3 years for revitalization options before sending them out. I go there and preach. I participate in congregational meetings. We're being very careful because we don't want any fatalities. We want everyone we send out to thrive in the ministry. And thus far, it's our 24th year, we have not had any fatalities by God's grace.
So it sounds very practical.
It is very practical.
It's very practical. It sounds a little bit like going to work out in the minor leagues before you go to the major leagues. You get a lot of reps, a lot of practice.
A lot of instruction in the minor leagues. You got hitting coaches, and you're receptive because you want to get to the major leagues, and you know, I got to listen to these guys. They're trying to hone my skills. So a lot of coaching.
So maybe you just graduated from a D1 college. You were a pretty great baseball player, and you think you're ready for the major leagues, but maybe you need a little time in the minors, or maybe you need some reps, some coaching, some instruction, so you don't blow that opportunity.
I mean, nobody goes directly to the major leagues. And it used to be that first-year quarterbacks never played. Now that's all changed with a mixed review, I think. You know, some people, we're Patriots fans, some people feel like Mac Jones got partly, I mean, they changed offensive coordinators, but maybe also you just get thrown into the mix there. So we're more like a baseball model. We're saying, yes, you've got a seminary degree, and that's great, but there's a lot of coaching that's still needed so you don't go in and blow up a church.
You know, we've all heard the saying, you don't know what you don't know. What don't you find that they know when they come out of seminary?
Well, they certainly don't know how to preach. And seminary is not really designed to teach them how to preach. It's designed to give them the tools so that they can become good preachers, but they don't know how to preach. And they especially don't know how to preach in a way that's both doctrinally sound and relevant. You know, the tendency is to push the relevancy idea, but lose some of the doctrine and some of the exegetical fidelity. Or, on the other side, it's all about theology and exegetical faithfulness, but so what? And so they just haven't had any experience preaching. So that's huge, because when you go out for a church plant, you don't have a facility usually. You don't have youth ministries, women's ministries, men's ministries. You don't have hardly anything. You've got Sunday morning. And if your preaching isn't strong enough to want to make them come back, you're going to have trouble. You're going to have trouble. So we want to be doctrinally faithful, exegetically rigorous, but we want people to feel like, I needed to hear that. That was just what I needed. Man, oh man, it's like he could read my mind. You want him to say that. So they don't know that. They don't know how to manage time. You know, pastors are self-employed guys. There's nobody telling them what to do. Their week is a blank slate. And if you don't know how to manage your time, structure your time, if you don't know how to plan what you're going to do, especially when you're planting a church, the whole thing will just collapse on you. So they know how to manage assignments. And if they have a family and if they worked, they've got some broad shoulders. But now they're having to manage when nobody's telling them what to do. There's no teacher saying this is due. There's no boss saying you got to be at work at this time. And now they got to provide all that structure for themselves. So that's a big, big deal. And they're not prepared to be persecuted. You know, I was pretty naive when I went into the ministry, Rob. I thought people would appreciate that I'm serving my heart out, trying to do the very best. I really didn't have a category for enemies in the church. You know, after 30 years in the pastorate, I agree with H.B. Charles, who said, sheep bite. And sometimes they bite very hard. And of course, the church is a mixed bag because you've got both believers and unbelievers. And sometimes the unbelievers can be fellow elders, leaders. That's very well precedented in the history of the church. So they're not prepared for that. They kind of got rose-colored glasses on. So you're trying to help them be prepared, so to be as shrewd as a serpent and to be as innocent as a dove. And then the last thing, I don't think they're prepared for the stress on marriage. Now, seminary can stress marriage, but, you know, the worst that can happen is you have to take a course over. It's not the end of the world. Or, you know, for some, getting a B or a C seems like the end of the world. I didn't really care about that when I was in seminary. My family was first, and that was the way it was. But the pressures of ministry, you got failing marriages, You got teens that are threatening to commit suicide. You've got all manner of personal problems that are ruining people's lives. And over all of that, you've got people going to hell. And the stress of that, the feeling like you just need to be in the game, in the game, in the game, in the game, can really cause some problems in a marriage. So learning how to manage what's obviously a vital calling to help people with these things while you're also taking care of your family, fathering your children. They're not prepared for the pull that pressure is going to bring. So those are some things that Nets, I think, not only in the residency program, but when we send them into the 4-year field program, we're supporting those guys in all those things. Because now they're into the mix. Now they've just jumped into the deep end of the pool, and they've not felt this pressure before in their lives.
I want to ask some questions about those things that you just brought up. Let's maybe just start backwards. How do you help a couple coming out of seminary that come up to Vermont to be a part of this program? How are you helping them with their marriage? I mean, they're probably not thinking that's what they're coming up for. But you're sharing that right now. We want to help strengthen their marriage. How do you help strengthen their marriage? Are you meeting with them personally?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes, individually and as couples and in group sessions. That's under the personal and family track. And Sue is leading the marriage, family, and ministry track just for the wives. And then the personal and family track is both husbands and wives. Yeah, we're doing some diagnostics. We're observing. Right away, you figure out, okay, how does this couple communicate? Are they a couple that's flexible, or do they have pretty tight boxes? Are they a couple that the husband's really leading, or are they functioning more like an egalitarian couple, even though they're saying they're complementarian? What's their communication like? Are they a couple that resolves conflicts, or are they a couple that just avoids conflicts at all costs? It's amazing how quickly that stuff becomes apparent. And in one of the assessments we send them to, that's a very significant part of the assessment. They're assessing the couple. And I have found that they do a pretty good job on that. So, as soon as we feel like we start to get a bead on the couple, we start talking to them about things. And we're talking to them about their intimate relation, because it's amazing how easy the stress of seminary can drive a couple apart. And it's not sustainable. So we're wanting to talk about that. Is there still a romantic twinkle in your eye now that you got 3 kids hanging on you? Because you know how kids, let's take over. And you're trying to carve out space so you and your wife can still be a couple. So we're interacting on those kinds of things. We're spending a lot of time on communication. We're spending a lot of time on what does it mean to be a servant? What does it mean to serve each other? What does it mean to serve the church? What does it mean to accommodate other people? If you think you're going to go into a church plant and come up with your schedule and this is how it's going to be, you're crazy and you're not going to succeed. Because if it's not clear that you're there to serve people, which means you have to adapt. You can't say, well, you adapt to me. No. The way they learn to do that is by watching you adapt to them, watching you flex your schedule. Yeah, I know you were planning to do that, but here's a need. It's Jesus and the disciples, and they follow him, and they were going to go rest for a while, and they're like, send them away. Jesus says, no, we're going to feed them. He was tired too. You got to have that mentality. So we're watching. Is that how they treat each other? When the baby cries during the church service, I want to see the man get up and take the baby to the back, because his wife's with that baby 24/7, and now he has a chance to relieve her of that. I'm not saying it has to happen every time, but I want to see, is there initiative taking? We're looking for that in their service to one another, because if they're not taking initiative with one another, why are they going to do that when they get out as pastors? We're not just sending them out to do a job. We're sending them out to be initiating servants to their church. And especially if you're a church planter, initiate. It's all initiation. You're working that. So those are the things we're looking at, Rob.
Well, Wes, I asked you earlier in the podcast, what kind of man are you looking for? It sounds to me like it's got to be a humble man, a coachable couple. When you bring these couples into nets, they've got to want this, don't they?
Yes, I was at a conference. I took all the elders to this conference at Alistair Begg's church many years ago, and Sinclair Ferguson was the keynote speaker. And they had a Q&A time after his presentation, and they asked him, what are you looking for in a staff person when you hire pastoral staff at your church? Without hesitating for a moment, he said, the number one thing I'm looking for is humility. And I would say that's the number one thing we're looking for. We're looking for teachability. We're looking for humility. If someone comes and it turns out they're not humble, our normal protocol is to hold them back a year. And they may not like that, so they may decide they don't want to do that. But I tell them, I say, look, I'm not able to do much with you because you're kind of fighting me. And so if you don't think you need this, I understand that. But we're going to speak into your lives, and I can already tell you, you need it. There's at least some aspects of what we're doing that's going to be helpful to you, and it would go much better for you, not to mention it's more godly, if you're really in the learner's position. So that's what we're looking for. So we poke pretty hard when we're recruiting to say, we're going to be pretty aggressive in mentoring, because if your marriage is going to withstand the pressures of either revitalizing a church or planting a church, it's going to have to really be humming. You can get by with a so-so marriage in an associate pastor position, where you're not really bearing the weight. But if you're bearing the weight, especially in some kind of startup or replant scenario, you got to be together. Husband and wife got to be together. You have to be experts at resolving your own conflicts, because you don't have time for week-long, ceasefires. You've got to be able to resolve it and move on. And so we're going to press there unapologetically, because we love you and we want to help your marriage to hum. Plus, it'll make your marriage a lot more fun. It's better to be able to get along. In every realm, it's better.
So you really want to see these couples build on their good marriages.
That's right.
Make them better, because they're going out under fire.
That's right. They're going out under fire. And that's, again, I don't think seminary preps for that. And seminary does virtually nothing with marriages. They can't. And again, I'm not criticizing seminary, Rob. I love seminaries. I believe in seminary. I have 3 seminary degrees and working on a 4th. I think it's valuable, but they can't do that kind of stuff. A personal mentoring program has the chance to actually get in there and find out what's going on and be helpful to a couple. And so we think that's one of the real unique aspects of NETS.
Can you give me an example, an anonymous example of something that you have seen in a marriage when they showed up at NETS, and then by God's grace, where it ended up at the end of that residency?
The biggest one, especially when you've got strong commitments to a complementarian value system, doctrinal position where the husband is the head of the wife, and we do believe in that unapologetically. I think that's what Ephesians chapter 5 says clearly. I think 1 Corinthians 11 is clear on that. Colossians 3, though short, same thing. Wives are to submit to their husbands. A husband's the head, just like Christ is the head of the church. I think the number one thing that we see is they're not working together, and the wife's voice is muted, because the husband's understanding of leadership is, I make the decisions. We're really talking about a true partnership. It might even look egalitarian to some people, but the basic idea is the wife needs to be heard. The husband needs to solicit her opinion on all things vital to the marriage. And he needs to listen to her in a way that she says he heard her. And if she doesn't sign off on that, we say to the guys, until she signs off, you haven't heard her. It doesn't count. I don't care how long it took. If she doesn't think you've really understood what she's had to say, you need to go back to the drawing board. So we're really raising the wife's value in the situation and nuancing the husband's idea of leadership, which is going to help him when he goes into the church, because he needs to listen to his elders. He needs to listen to his congregation. See, there's an idea that if you're doing all that listening, somehow you're not really in charge. Somehow you're not really leading. That's a non sequitur. It's not necessarily so. In fact, I would say you're going to be able to better lead if you've really heard what your wife has to say. And she's going to be much more willing to follow if she thinks you've listened to her and taken her opinion into consideration. And you'll probably come out with a better solution because she's bringing things to the table that you perhaps didn't think about, like how she feels. Her feelings matter. So that's the biggest thing, is trying to help guys that have good theology, good notions of leadership, biblically speaking, but they don't know how to play that out in the relational playing field.
So really learning how to listen to your wife.
Yes, that's right.
Hear her.
Hear her. Every Nets resident and his wife reads a book called To Understand Each Other. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to say it's about understanding, not talking. It's about understanding. If you're understanding the other person, whatever move you make as a leader is going to be a better move because you've really understood where that other person is coming from. Doesn't mean you agree, doesn't mean you capitulate, but it means you've understood.
So this is my final question for this episode. We're going to have to pick this up where we're leaving off, and I feel bad for our listeners because this is really good stuff, and they got to wait 2 weeks to hear the rest. But I do want to ask you, what's the upshot? Now the husband's listening to the wife like he's never listened to her before. She feels like she's being heard. How does that end up helping them plant or revitalize a church?
Well, because they're going into this thing together, and the ability to come up with any number of decisions regarding how to go about planting this church, that ability is going to be enhanced if we've got two people weighing in on it rather than one. I mean, their marriage is going to be enhanced, their parenting is going to be enhanced, and the church plant's going to be enhanced. I mean, I'll give you an example. We moved to Vermont in 1991, and a church had just imploded the previous summer. And the pastor of that church approached me, and now he was down to 7 or 8 couples. It wasn't a big church to start with. And he said to me, if you will take us in, I will follow your leadership. And you'll have people. Because we moved up here uninvited. We essentially knew nobody. The only person I knew wasn't in a position to become a part of the church. So we had no people and virtually no money. And now this guy's offering me 7 or 8 couples. And I knew theologically there was tremendous affinity in terms of our beliefs. Well, I was ready to go. And, Sue and I both met with the pastor and his wife. She heard the whole appeal. We went home that night, and she said, I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole. Really? Explain it to me. So she kind of went down her reasons. And after I got done listening to her, I thought, she is absolutely right. And my eagerness to get things going was blocking my vision to really appreciate the liabilities that were attended. And what became clear in the next 2 or 3 years is that this guy was impossible to lead. He would have blown things up, and he blew up everything he touched from that point forward. So, the fact that I was willing to listen, again, I made the decision. Sue isn't confused. She understands I'm the head, and in the church, obviously, she's not a part of the leadership formally, but she was just wiser than I was. And by listening to her, we avoided something that I think would have been a stillborn church. If it would have flown, we would have had to start all over, and now we've got all kinds of collateral damage that we're dealing with. So I think a wife's input is absolutely invaluable. And it's invaluable for the home, because if the home's not going well, the church isn't going to go well. You can't play that game.
So don't just listen to your wife. You're not training these couples or mentoring or counseling these couples, whatever word you might want to use, to learn how to listen to their wives. So you can say you listen to your wife, and your wife can say, well, that's nice, I feel listened to. It's because the wife sort of has a superpower that you want to tap into. She's got an entire ability to see things that you don't see.
Especially in the relational realm. I mean, anyone that's been married knows that wives have this sixth sense relationally. And I know it's not always like that. And especially if a woman's become a career woman, she may be less oriented in that direction because she's had to toe the business line. She's had to play corporate America. I get that. But in general, as a stereotype, women have that relational sense. I mean, I saw it with our 5 kids. She was just more in tune with how our kids were feeling. So, my goodness, what pastor doesn't want to be helped in getting the relational landscape clear in his mind? And of course, Rob, all men know that have any brains at all that women are smarter than men. So you put all that together, and I'm sure that would get some reaction. But gosh, you've got this associate, your best friend, and she's got some really valuable things to say. I'm all ears. I want to benefit from that. That helps the marriage just as a byproduct, because what wife doesn't appreciate a husband that values her, that treats her as a joint heir of the grace of life, as 1 Peter says. So, yeah, it's a win-win-win-win-win situation.
Hard to imagine any couple would get to the end of the residency and not have a stronger marriage and a deeper love for one another.
I think the couples would testify that it helped their marriages. That's a pretty uniform testimony from folk that come to the NETS program. In fact, if I really didn't want to do church planting, we could just do marriage mentoring and have a marriage mentoring ministry, and I think it would fly, because you don't get that in seminary. And it's just hard to find people that are both in a position to do that and have the time and commitment to do that. And that's just part of the NETS program.
So certainly any married couple would benefit from better communication, deeper understanding of each other. And certainly it's even more important in the pastorate, and then even more important, you might say, for church planners and revitalizers.
Yeah, because that's a bigger pressure cooker than just an established pastorate, because nothing's in place.
Well, Wes, I really appreciate this conversation. At our next episode, we're going to go and talk more about NETS and what does this residency look like. And I also want to talk a little bit about something new that you've got, which is the summer pastoral internship, which was new in 2024. I think it was a big hit. We did have an episode, a podcast about that, but I just want to talk about your vision for that and why the internship and the residency. How do they complement one another? What's the strategy? All of that. So thanks. I appreciate this. I know we camped out a little bit on the marriage thing. It's just so critical. And I know it's a really big piece, and it's a really strong suit for you and Sue. I mean, you're just quite good at helping other couples build the strongest marriage possible.
And one other thing, it's critical to being qualified to be an elder. I mean, this is ground zero for elder qualification, a man who manages his own family well. And that includes and starts with a good marriage. So that's probably why we've put so much focus on it. And even a blind squirrel finds a few nuts. So Sue and I have had plenty of problems in our marriage that we've had to work through, and that enables us to be more helpful.
And with that said, we're looking forward to having Sue on the podcast soon. We'd love to talk to her. And I think a lot of people will enjoy listening to her, maybe more than you, Wes.
I would.
Yeah, I would too. And I'm looking forward to it especially. Right. So thanks, Wes. I appreciate it.
All Good to be here.
To learn more about the NETS Center for Church Planning and Revitalization's training and sending programs, visit us online at thenetscenter.org. For questions or comments, email us at pastorpastor@thenetscenter.org. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe and consider sharing this episode with a friend. This podcast is a production of the NETS Center for Church Planning and Revitalization. NETS, for the life of the church.